Today's video is going to be absolutely action-packed because a couple of days ago, OpenAI released some features and new functionality which are absolutely huge. And I feel these features are some of the biggest breakthroughs since the launch of ChatGPT. And so in today's video, I'm going to be telling you exactly what those new features and functionalities are. And I'm also going to be going in depth in one of the bigger features that has been launched just a few days ago. And then a little bit later in the video, I'm going to be showing you a fully functioning proof of concept app that I built that shows you how you can leverage one of the biggest breakthroughs that was just launched. Now, before we get started, as always, all the apps and all the resources that I demonstrate on this channel are available to view and or clone from my Patreon page. And so if you're not yet a member of our amazing Patreon community, then I definitely urge you to check it out, and you can do so using the link in the description below the video. So a few days ago, OpenAI announced some new models and developer products. And if you scroll down, you can see that some of the features that were launched, one was a new GPT-4 turbo model that is more capable, cheaper, and supports a 128,000 context window. We have something called an Assistance API that makes it super easy for developers to build their own assistive AI apps that have goals and can call models and tools. And we also have new multimodal capabilities in the platform, including vision, image creation, and text-to-speech. Here we have the GPT-4 Turbo with 128K context, okay? And this is obviously huge, but it's also fairly self-explanatory, right? You have a new model that has a much bigger context, and this allows you to fit the equivalent of more than 300 pages of text in a single prompt. And so they also optimize the performance, and it's also 3 times cheaper for input tokens and 2 times cheaper for output tokens. So you can use this model right away. Next, we have function calling updates, right? So if you recall, I talked about function calling in one of the previous videos, but essentially function calling lets you describe functions of your app or external APIs to models and have the model intelligently choose to output a JSON object containing arguments to call these functions. And we are going to be talking a little bit more about function calling when I show you the proof of concept app. We also have improved instructions for JSON mode, right? So this is really, really nice. So if you're asking ChatGPT for various pieces of data, maybe a data dump, you can actually make sure that it responds in a JSON form. And this is actually very, very useful because, in fact, just recently I was developing an app and I was struggling with having ChatGPT consistently output a JSON encoding data, and you can do it much more easily, and it's going to be a lot more predictable using this new feature. So we have a bunch of other features, but the main feature that I want to talk about in today's video is the Assistance API. And this is an amazing feature. And I actually feel that this is one of the bigger features, one of the bigger breakthroughs since the release of ChatGPT almost a year ago, right? This is an amazing feature with its own API that you can start using right now, and it can do some amazing things, okay? Now, instead of reading all of this text, let me explain to you how this new Assistance API works using an easy to follow diagram. Okay, so if you think about traditional ChatGPT behavior, this is kind of how it works, right? We have the user, and the user is talking to ChatGPT via the UI, right? And ChatGPT has an access to corpus of data, right? So this is data that it, crawled from the internet, essentially crawled the whole internet, has all of this data and has a cutoff time, right? And you ask a question, it goes, looks in the data, it figures out what you want, maybe it does some deduction, some intelligence, and it gets your response, okay? But in a way, this data you cannot control it, right? This is a data that's available to everyone, regardless of what you're trying to do with ChatGPT, okay? You can kind of fine-tune the results that you're getting using some prompt engineering, but for the most part, everybody that uses ChatGPT has access to the same corpus of data. Well, this new Assistance API completely changes that. And so the way that this works is that you can create your own assistant that's finely tuned, that's customized for your own use case, with your own data, with your own functions, with your own code interpreter, a lot of things that you can customize for your specific application. So in a way, you're going to be creating your assistant, and you can give that assistant your own data, right? So you can upload a file, you can upload a text file, you can upload a PDF, you can upload all kinds of files, and that assistant can reference that file. Okay, but that's not all. You can also specify custom functions, and these are the functions that we just talked about, where ChatGPT has improved the way these functions work. Now, a quick refresher for those of you who are not familiar with how these custom functions work. So when you're building your own assistant here, right, you can give it your own corpus of data, but in some situations, you might need a more of a real-time value. So you can upload a PDF, but let's say your user wants to know something specific, something current, something real-time, such as the weather. Let's say the user wants to know what is the current weather in San Francisco. Well, your corpus of data is not going to be able to supply the answer to that query. Instead, what custom functions give you, it gives you the ability to execute a function that you host, a function that you control, because the model realized that what the user is asking needs to be referenced using an external function. Now, you, of course, are going to provide the prototype to these functions, right? Just like how you're providing the data. And so now the system knows that it has access to the special data, and it also has access to these custom functions in case the LLM decides that it needs something specific, it needs something real-time, as you're going to see a little bit later in the video. And last but not least, you can also enable for your own custom assistant a code interpreter. So if you're not familiar what a code interpreter is, a code interpreter essentially allows you to execute code in order to get a specific result. So LLMs are typically not really strong when it comes to mathematical questions, right? They're really, really good when it comes to data, but when it comes to math, they're not really, really good. Well, fortunately, ChatGPT can generate a piece of code that when you execute it, gives the specific answer that the user was seeking. And we're also going to be covering this a little bit later in the video. And so as a result, after you build your custom GPT assistant, the queries are going to take into account this data, these tools, these extra functionalities that you've provided to your custom GPT assistant. So things like data, right? Maybe a PDF file, a text file, etc. Specific functions which allow the user to get specific real-time information that might not be available in this data corpus, and as well as this code interpreter functionality that will enable the system to generate a piece of code to evaluate a mathematical expression. And obviously a GPT assistant is going to be customized for a specific use case, and you can create multiple of these GPT assistants quickly and easily. Now, in terms of actually building these assistants, you can head over to OpenAI's documentation and you can read more about these assistants. And here is an assistants API that you can leverage to build these assistants for your specific use case programmatically. So by executing a bunch of API calls, and here it tells you that you can create an assistant in the API by defining its custom instructions and picking a model. After that, you create something called a thread. When a user starts a conversation, then you can add messages to the thread as the user asks questions. And last but not least, you need to run the assistant on the thread to trigger responses. Okay, and this automatically calls the relevant tools. And here they have a step-by-step guide that shows you how you can create these assistants. And if you click on how assistants work, you can see in greater detail how to follow each of these steps and create these assistants, right? So you can create an assistant here. They give you some instructions. You can manage threads and messages, and you can run the assistant with a specific thread. So the diagram looks something like this. First, you create an assistant, then you create a thread, and then you fill it in with messages. And this is essentially when the user is interacting with the model. So the user asks something, they get a response. The user asks something again, they get a response. And all of these are messages. in a specific thread. And then you're going to run an assistant on a specific thread that you have defined in the previous steps. Now, the result is not going to be instant, okay? Because depending on, what kind of data you have in this assistant, remember, you can upload various files, you can upload PDFs, you can upload text files. And so if you have uploaded a very, very big PDF file, the system needs to analyze that PDF file in order to give you the answer that you were seeking or the user was seeking. And that's also the case if you have a very, very complicated mathematical expression. The system needs to generate the code using the code interpreter. And as a result, it's going to take some time. And so this operation is going to be asynchronous, which means that when you run an assistant, the system tells you, okay, we started to run it. And then you need to come back and see if the operation has failed in order to get the responses to your queries. And this, in a nutshell, is how you build your own assistant. Another useful piece of documentation is their API reference, right? So if you scroll down and you click on assistants, you will learn everything that you need to know when it comes to building these assistants using the API, right? So you have the assistants and you can create an assistant, retrieve, modify, etc., etc. You also have threads. You can do all of this, messages, and last but not least, you can also run the assistant with a specific thread. Now, another very, very useful place where you can get actual hands-on experience with these assistants is by heading to OpenAI's Playground. Now, if you click here, you can see that I have 3 assistants that I have created using OpenAI's Playground. So the first assistant is a data analysis assistant, where I will provide a specific file and I will ask questions based on that file. The next assistant is a math tutor assistant, and this assistant is going to be excelling in mathematical formulas and mathematical questions. And last but not least, we have a weather expert assistant, and this assistant is going to leverage an external function that I'm going to specify. And so if we go back to Playground here, you can see that I can pick an assistant. So for instance, we have this data analysis assistant that I have defined and have created, right? So I gave it a name, I gave it instructions, I picked this new cutting edge model, and I also gave it a retrieval ability, which means that now I can upload files, and this specific assistant is going to look into those files in order to give me the answer that I'm seeking. And for this specific assistant, I uploaded a PDF that talks about the Roman Empire, and this is the PDF right here. The decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And this is a fairly long PDF, right? There's like over 300 pages in here. So if you go all the way down, this PDF has a little bit over 400 pages. And this assistant had no issues dealing with a file of this size. And once I define all of this, I simply click save. And now I have an assistant with a thread window that I could talk to. Now, as I am building these assistants here and I'm creating new threads and sending new messages, OpenAI is executing that API that we talked about under the hood. So all of this is being done using the API. And this is exactly what you're going to be leveraging when you're going to be building your custom apps, as I'm going to show you in just a little bit. Now, I also have other assistants. So here's a math tutor, and this is the name right here. And so it's called a math tutor. And for instructions, I told it that you are a personal math tutor. When asked a question, write and run Python code to answer the question. Okay, so in this case, I've enabled this code interpreter feature. Okay, and last but not least, we have the weather expert, right? So if you load that, the name is the weather expert. And for instructions, I told it you're my weather expert. I will ask you questions about weather and you will provide answers. And in this case, I gave it a function, right? So you can simply click on add, and they have a couple of examples. So get weather and get stock. And in this case, I just gave it get weather, which looks something like this, right? This is my JSON definition for a function. And once I provide this function definition, the assistant will know when to tell me that I need to execute this function in response from a query from a user that I'm going to show you in just a second. So as an example, let's say I create a new thread and I say, what's the temperature in San Francisco? Okay, now I'm asking a question having to do with weather, and because I provided a function prototype, this assistant will know to tell me that I need to execute the function and give it a response. So check this out. If I say add and run, it's going to leverage the fact that it knows this function. And as you can see, it's telling me that I need to call this function according to the specs that I gave it. So now, assuming that my system has called the function, it's asking me for the answer. And here I'm going to fill in a JSON object. I'm going to say temp25. Okay, this is an answer that my function gave me back that I'm providing to the LLM, right? I'm going to click submit. And now the LLM knows that the temperature is 25, and now it needs to come up with an answer. And this is the answer that it came up with. The current temperature in San Francisco is 25 degrees Celsius, right? And so this is how functions work. And obviously, you can leverage all of this via an API. And obviously, I have different assistants that were configured differently. So if I go to this math tutor, I can start a new thread. I can click clear here and I can start a new thread. In this case, I want to ask it a mathematical question. I can ask it something like this. Please solve this equation. Okay, so something like this, something very, very simple. And it needs to solve for X, right? And I'm going to say add and run. And in this case, it's generating Python code that when executed is going to solve the equation, right? So if you click here, you can see the code that it has generated and ran. And as a result, it got X is 1, right? Because 3 times 1 is 3, 3 plus 11 is 14. So a very, very simple equation that it has trouble solving without writing the code and generating the code, right? And this is because we gave it this code interpreter ability. And last but not least, I also have this data analysis, right? So if we clear this, and the prompt here, you're my data analysis, I will provide you with a file that explains the history of the Roman Empire, and I will ask you questions about the information contained in the file. And in this case, we're using this retrieval functionality, and I uploaded the file that I show you. This is the file right here. And so now I can go back here and I can say, according to the file provided, what were the reasons as to why the Roman Empire collapsed, might have collapsed, okay? I'm going to click on add and run. So we're adding the message and we are running the thread, and we need to wait for the system to kind of read through the file and make sense of it and then come up with an answer. All right, and there's the answer. According to the provided file, the Roman Empire might have collapsed due to memorable series of revolutions, which over the course of approximately 13 centuries gradually undermined and at length destroyed the solid fabric of human greatness. And here it's also providing a footnote, right? So you can click on this reference and you can see where exactly it came up with that answer, where exactly in the file that helped it to kind of figure out the answer. And so as you can see, the assistant functionality is extremely powerful because you can customize it any way that you want in order to make sure that it's able to give the results that the users are seeking, regardless if the data is going to come from some third-party file, you need to execute code, or you need to run an external function. It's all customizable on a specific assistant level. All right, so now that you have a general understanding of what an assistant is and the immense amount of value that it can provide to you, your users, or your customers, let me show you a proof of concept app that I built using Flutterflow, which is my favorite no-code tool. All right, so here we are inside of Flutterflow, but let me first show you how this app works. And then we're going to jump back in and I'm going to show you how I built everything out. All right, so here's the app. And on the first screen, I am listing the 3 assistants that I have previously defined. So we have the assistant's name and the corresponding ID. If we click on any of these assistants, we can see a specific thread with the messages inside of that thread. So let's say we click on Math Tutor here. It loads the messages and we see the messages for a specific thread, right? So the first message is from me. Help me solve the following equation. 3x plus 11 equals 14. And at this point, it generated the code. It executed the code, and this is the result that it got. X is equal to 1, which is the correct answer. Next, we have the data analysis, right? So if I click here we have a question from me. According to the file provided, what are the reasons given as to why the Roman Empire collapsed? And here it came up with an answer. Now, you might notice that the answer displayed here is slightly different than the answer displayed here. And that is because I am displaying here a completely different thread than the thread that we are looking at here. So it's a different thread. And like I explained before, you can have multiple threads for a specific assistant, with each thread having a series of messages. And last but not least, we have the weather expert assistant. So if I click here I asked it, what's the weather in San Francisco tomorrow? And after it asked me to execute this function, and after I submitted the result using the playground, it was able to generate a response using a result that I submitted after executing the function, as though I executed the function. So I gave it that the answer is 25, and it came up with this response right here. The weather in San Francisco tomorrow will be around 25 degrees Celsius. And this is exactly the same way that we did it using this playground, right? We asked the question, the system realized that it needs to execute a function. It gave us the function to execute with the arguments. I ostensibly executed the function. I came back with the result. I typed it in. I said temp is 25. It figured out that, the temperature is 25. Temp means temperature. And then it came up with a response that I can use in my app. So very, very powerful. Now, all of these messages and all of these assistants are real-time API calls. And so I can head to one of these assistants here, and I can ask it another message. And what that's going to do is that's going to create a brand new thread with the message that I provided. And so as an example, let's say we are looking to ask it questions regarding that Roman Empire file. And so I can ask it another question. According to the file provided, could anything have prevented the Roman Empire's collapse? And when I click on this button, it's going to create a brand new thread with this message, and then it's going to run this newly created thread tied to this data analysis assistant. And remember, when we initially configured this data analysis assistant, we gave it some config settings, right? So we gave it a prompt, we also gave it a file, and it's going to use that data to give us the answer. Okay, so I'm going to execute this, and here's the response that we got back. The excerpt from the file suggests that one factor contributing to the Roman Empire's collapse was the tyrannical and avaricious behavior of Emperor Maximin, which was a turning point that led to rebellion. You can kind of read more about it, and it also provides a source as to how it arrived to that answer. And so now if we go back to this main assistance window and we click on data analysis, we are looking at a brand new thread with this question that we have queried it, and this is the answer that we got back. That old thread is still there, but now we are displaying this brand new thread. Now let's go back to Flutterflow so that I can show you how I design and build this app. So here we are back inside of Flutterflow's UI builder. And remember, if you're a member of our amazing Patreon community, you're going to have access to this exact app, which means that you can view it on your own computer and or clone it if you so desire. And obviously, if you want to build these kinds of apps, you're going to learn a ton by cloning this app. Now, this app has two screens. We have the assistant screen and we have the messages screen, right? So the assistant screen displays the various assistant information. And when you click on any of these assistants, you're going to be redirected to this messages screen. And this is where you're going to see the messages, the conversation that's happening with that specific assistant. Now, if you go to assistants, the way that I'm displaying these assistants is simply using app state. So I'm not querying the system or anything like that. I'm just using the existing assistants that I defined here in Playground, okay? So if we go to our data types, I have a data type called assistant type, and I'm using it as a way to store these existing assistants. So we're storing the assistant ID, the assistant name, and here I'm also storing a specific thread that I'm looking to load for that specific assistant. Now, if you go into app state, you can see that the only app state variable I have is this assistant list, which is a list of these assistant type data types. And I define 3 of these, which represent the 3 assistants that I have here. So if I click on assistants, I have 3 assistants. And so if I go back here, I have 3 assistants. So I have this math tutor, this is the ID, and this is the thread ID that I want to load. And here I have the data analysis. This is the assistant ID. This is the thread ID I want to load. And last but not least, we have the weather expert. This is the assistant ID and the thread that I want to load. And so all that's happening on this page is I'm simply listing all of these assistants here, and I'm making sure that when the user clicks on it, we are passing some data to the second page so we can load that specific thread. And so if the user clicks on this container here, they're going to be redirected to the messages screen. And on the messages screen, we're going to load all the messages having to do with that specific thread, right? So if I click on this container, I have an action here. If you open this up, all we're doing is we're navigating to messages. And here I'm passing the ID of the container in the list. So from 0 to whatever. So if it's the first one, I'm passing 0. The second, I'm passing 1. Third, I'm passing 2. And I need that number in order to pull up the data from the app state, right? So this is what I'm passing. It's index and list. Now, if you go here to the messages, I have a very, very simple messages screen where we are displaying a bunch of messages for a specific thread. And we also have an input where we can create a new thread with the new message that the user types here. And so the first thing that we're doing is we are loading existing messages for the provided thread ID that we have provided on the assistant page, right? So here I have a list view. And this list view is going to execute an API call, and I'm executing list messages, and I'm specifying this thread ID that I got from the first page. And this list view is defined in our APIs. I only have 2 APIs. I have list messages and new messages. So this list messages is using this API here, and this is the API that we're using, right? So if we go to messages, we're using this list messages where you need to provide the thread ID. And so for this API call, I only have one variable, which is the thread ID that we are passing in here. And when we do a response and test, I can, just specify a real thread ID here, and I do a test API call. I get my messages, right? So I'm getting a list of messages. Okay, so these are the list of messages, and here I am grabbing some information, so like message content, message role, and the actual list of messages that I'm going to be using when I'm going to be displaying the actual messages, right? So this is our list view, and the next thing that I'm doing is I'm creating a stack that contains the rows. And the reason I want to do a stack is that we're going to be displaying these rows conditionally, right? So one row is going to be displayed if this is, the text, the message from the AI, from the assistant. And another row is going to be messages that I send, that the user sends. And we need a stack because we don't know which row we're going to be displaying. That's going to be determined while the app is running at runtime. And so this is the user's AI row, and I have a condition. So I'm checking if the user role is not user, right? I'm using a custom function to do that. And here I'm checking for role equals to user. And here I'm saying the opposite statement, which means that the role is not user, which means that this is a role from the assistant. In this case, I want this row to be left justified. Otherwise, I have the user row that I want to be right justified. And as a result, you have that familiar messages interface where the messages you sent are going to be on the right-hand side, whereas the messages that you receive are going to be on the left-hand side. Now, for the list view here, once we execute the API call, we need to cycle through the responses, right? So here I'm saying that we got back a response, but I'm only interested in that data list. And this is something that I defined in that API section that I showed you just a couple of moments ago. And so here I need to do this because I need to cycle through those messages. I'm not interested in the response as is. I just need to cycle through those messages. And so I'm looking at each of the data lists and I'm calling it data item. And then when the time comes to actually display the individual items here, I can look at the data item and I can say, well, there's the data item. Find me the text value. That's the value of the message, or find me something else, right? These are these JSON paths that gives you a very, very reliable way to get specific information from a JSON response. And if you're dealing with API calls, you need to understand JSON paths and you need to make sure that you understand how to get that data. So essentially, we're listing all the messages, and if the role is user, we're displaying it on the right-hand side. Otherwise, we're displaying it on the left-hand side. And here the user can enter a new message and we have a call, right? I should probably rename this button to something else. So like something like send. And here what we are doing is we have a bunch of actions. The first thing we're doing is we're executing an API call, and the API call is new message. And if I show you this API call, very, very simple. And so what we're doing here is we are not only creating a new thread, we're also putting the message that the user entered into that thread. And then we're executing all of this in one shot. And this is the API call that I'm using, create thread and run. And that way it can create the thread, create the message, and run the whole thing all in one shot, which is very, very helpful in this specific case. And so if we go to the body, we have the body that we're defining, we're passing in the assistant ID, and here we are passing the message, we're sending the role. And the role is always going to be user, right? This doesn't even need to be a variable. It's always going to be user, but I made it the variable. And the content is the message that the user types in the bottom section of the view there. And so we can go to response and test. And here I can specify assistant ID. The role is always user, and I can say, what's the capital of Mexico? And when I execute it, I'm going to be creating a brand new thread. I'm going to be assigning this message here to that thread, and then I'm going to be running that thread on this assistant, right? You can create a thread and run it on any assistant that you want, because each assistant is designed to do something different. And so let's say I have it on this assistant ID. I can just simply run it right here. And so as soon as I run it, the status is queued. That means that it has accepted my request, and we need to check back once it has the answer for us. So now let's go back to the rest of this flow. Now, if the API call has succeeded, I have a debugging message here. This is a simple alert dialog that displays the raw response. And here I have a simple delay. And the purpose of this delay is to simulate the app waiting for the system to process and give me a response. And last but not least, I'm finally updating the app state with the newly created thread ID. Because if you recall, when the user enters the message and presses send, we're creating a brand new thread with that message. And as a result, we get back a new thread ID. And because everything displayed on the app uses state, we need to update our app state with the new thread ID. And this is exactly what I'm doing. I'm updating the assistant object with the new thread ID that I received from the API call, because when the user presses the button and it executes this run request, we immediately get back this new thread ID that we have just created. And so we can grab this thread ID and we can update app state. As soon as we update app state, we rebuild the current page, and as a result, we display the new thread with the new messages. Now, while this proof of concept gives you a glimpse of how you can build fairly sophisticated apps using this new Assistance API, this proof of concept is still fairly limited. There's lots and lots of things that you can do depending on your specific use case. And to build amazingly powerful and easy to use apps that leverage this Assistance API, you need to be able to view and or clone this exact app that I created. And you can do just that when you join our amazing Patreon community. And remember, when you join our amazing Patreon community, not only will you get access to this app, but you'll get access to over 150 other no-code apps that I built on this channel. They're all there, and they're all waiting for you to view and or clone them. And this means that you can leverage the functionalities that I built into each of these apps to accomplish just about anything. And so regardless of what kind of app that you're going to be building, whether it's very, very simple app or something that's more complex, you can bet that I've probably done it before. So instead of reinventing the wheel, you can leverage the apps that are already out there that do some of the functionality that you're looking to replicate with your own project. And that's not all. When you join our amazing Patreon community, you're going to get access to more content. You're going to get access to things like Q&As, live streams, behind the scenes content, as well as our Patreon supported masterclass series, where I do deep dives on specific topics that the community votes on. And in fact, just in a couple of days, I'm going to be doing a comprehensive Q&A asking all of your questions that you have submitted via Patreon. And so if you're not sure of something, or maybe you're stuck while building the app of your dreams, then you can ask your question as well, and I will definitely cover it in our upcoming Q&A. And above all, when you join our amazing Patreon community, you're going to be supporting this channel and supporting my work, and that is greatly, greatly appreciated. And so if any of what I just talked about sounds like it's going to provide you with some level of value, then I definitely urge you to check out our amazing, rapidly growing Patreon community and consider becoming a member. And you can do just that via the link in the description below the video.